Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we have Uglytruck in the shop and we're going to be making some pretty major changes to it that are either going to completely ruin how this thing drives or it's going to make it a whole lot more usable and a whole lot more fun. Now the plan originally was to be swapping out the wastegate spring to increase the boost level because right now I have a 5-pound spring in the gate and on the boost controller totally maxed out. It makes like 8 pounds of boost and that puts it right at 480 horse and 620 pounds of torque at the tire, which is quite a bit, but one thing to keep in mind is that peak torque occurs at 4,000 RPM and the torque does fall off pretty quickly after that. So today, instead of raising the boost level, I'm going to be undoing a change that I made over a year ago before I even had the 8.1 swapped in, and that's changing the gear ratios. You see, back then I had a 5.3 in it with the 4L80, and the 4L80s have a really tall first gear, and the 5.3s don't make a lot of torque compared to a big block anyway. And so it just was struggling taking off and getting up to speed. So I figured let's re-gear and let's go from the stock 342 all the way up to a 430 to 1. Now on the 5.3, I loved it. It made a really huge improvement. And at the time I was actually considering swapping to a 4.2 inline 6. Now that would have been a totally different engine combination, and the small engine like that definitely would have taken advantage of a steep gear like a 430 and it has a higher RPM range. But plans changed and I went with a turbo big block instead. Now I'm actually really happy with my engine choice and this thing is a blast to drive, but the 430s are a bit much. If you're just cruising down the highway at like 75 miles an hour, with my tire size it's doing like 3,000 RPM and 75 around here is hardly keeping up with traffic. So I want to make it spin a lower RPM and be able to drive faster. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, but I believe if I install a numerically lower gear, it'll actually improve acceleration because we're going to be keeping the engine at a lower RPM, much closer to its peak torque, and we'll be able to load the turbo just a little bit harder. So we're going to go back to the stock 342s. Now, it might be a little bit slow taking off, and we'll find out. We're going to be going for a test drive once this is all said and done. You might be wondering, why don't I go with like a 373 or something a little bit more in the middle of the road? I actually don't want to be buying any more parts for this 8.6 bolt for a little while. The differential that's in there now, I think it's going to hold up okay, but I drained the oil a little while ago and I noticed a little bit of metal in there and I know it's not coming from the ring and pinion, so I'm hoping that the differential will be okay. It's not the stock G80, it's been replaced with a TrueTrac, but the short version is I just don't want to put any more money into the 8.6 bolt and I have the stock 342s, so we're just going to basically put the gear ratio back to stock and hopefully this thing will do a whole lot better driving down the road. Alrighty guys, you talked and I listened. You say I ramble on and on, which I am guilty of. I know I like to talk. I try to do as in-depth of technical explanations as I can, but lately they've been getting to be like 4 and 5 minutes long a piece, so I'm going to try to keep them short, but then sprinkle them maybe a little bit more frequently throughout the installation just to kind of better explain what we're doing. So the first part of regearing a semi-floating axle, you want to get the few components on the outside out of the way so we can access what's on the inside. The brake calipers and rotors need to go because the axle shaft is going to have to get pushed in to dislodge the C-clips, which we'll get to in a second, and then we'll have to pull this out so the caliper bracket would be in the way. And then the drive shaft needs to get disconnected from the yoke way up in there because we're going to have to take that to get the pinion gear out of the way. And then finally, if you have a rear anti-sway bar like this one does, whether it's factory or aftermarket, more than likely you need to swing that down out of the way just so you can access the carrier. So next thing we got to do is pop the diff cover, drop the fluid, and then we'll get the carrier out of the way. To get the differential out of any axle, first you have to remove the axle shafts from the differential, and on a full floater it's really easy because they just bolt right into the end of the hub. So you undo the bolt, slide the axle out of the way, and you're good to go. But on a C-clip style axle, well, there's actually C-clips that sit down inside the differential, kind of right there, and that's what holds the axle from pulling out. So on a TrueTrac like this for the 8.6 and 8.5/10 bolt, first you've got to pull off this little retainer here, and that's held in with a C-clip. And then there's this little guy right here. I just call it like a puck because it just sits right there in between the two axle shafts, and this is what stops them from pushing in. So once this pops out, slide the axles in, then you can get the C-clips out of the way, and then the axles can pull out, allowing you to remove the carrier. Of course, you want to make sure you mark the position of the caps, both left and right, in terms of up and down. The very last thing for the teardown is pulling the pinion out of the housing, so I just start by removing the pinion nut, move the pinion yoke, and then just drive the pinion out of the axle. Now I always put a small pointed punch in this center right there and drive on the punch. Never ever do you want to hit on that guy right there because you'll damage the threads if you ever want to reuse that, so the nut will still go on. If in the future I want to put 430s in a 10 bolt. Now I did also remove the large pinion bearing from the Pinion because I needed the shim that was underneath. This is the stock 34 thousandths inch shim that was on my 342s before, so that's the one we're going to put back in, and it's basically going to take all the guesswork out of setting this thing up because we're just putting it back to exactly the same way that it was. So when it comes to setting up a differential or a ring and pinion gear set, there are 3 measurements that are ultra critical that you get spot on for this thing to last a long time. There is pinion depth, pinion bearing preload, and then there is carrier backlash. And we just took care of the first 2. So the first one, pinion depth, that was super easy on this particular installation because I had the original gear set going back into the original housing with the original pinion depth shim. But if this were a new set, more or less, it would involve just finding the correct thickness of shim to go between the bearing and the head of the pinion to get it spot on. Now, if you want to watch one of my other videos from about a year ago, I'll put the link up in the corner or however that's supposed to work. I'll show you my method of getting it set. So check out that video. The next thing that I set was pinion bearing preload. That's basically how much force it takes to turn the bearing in the housing with no other, like with no carrier in it. There's 2 different specifications, one for new bearings, one for old. The new bearing set is 14 to 19 inch-pounds of rotation. The old is 6 to 8 inch-pounds. And I have 1 new bearing and 1 old bearing, so I just kind of set it right in the middle. And when you set it, basically you just tighten down the nut. And there's something in here called a crush washer. This is the old one. And more or less what happens is as you tighten it down, the outer bearing touches on here, and the bottom of the crush collar sits there. And basically you tighten down the nut and the yoke until it squishes that little collar there until the bearings get closer together. And you kind of notice what I did. I just hit it with the impact and I kept going little bits at a time until I could, I wiggled it to make sure there was no play. And I kept hitting it a little bit more and more until all the play was gone, and then just a couple more times until you got just the right amount of drag. Now, if you overshoot your pinion bearing preload, don't just loosen the nut. You have to take it back apart and put in a new crush collar to do it right. So I always grab a couple extras just in case I do accidentally overshoot, because when you do it with an impact, it's really easy to go too far. So anyway, those are how we set up pinion bearing preload and pinion depth. So the next thing I got to do is get the new ring gear, or the old ring gear, swapped over to my carrier, and then we'll talk about backlash. Now, there's one thing you can't skip on when you're doing an installation like this, or really any work in the shop in the summertime. That's ice cream. So I highly recommend an ice cream sandwich. Kind of clears your brain and it makes your gear install go better. Another one. So the very last thing that you're gonna have to set is carrier backlash. Now, I wish I had measured the 342s way back when before I pulled them out to know what they were running at, because that would be really the best way to do this. But because I don't have that information, the best thing that I can do now is just set them up somewhere within the factory spec, which is somewhere between 5 and 9 thousandths of an inch. So it took a couple of tries to get it exactly where I wanted using different thicknesses of shim. But basically, if your backlash is too tight, shift the carrier away from the pinion, or if it's too loose, put it a little bit closer. My final combination ended up being 225 thousandths on the right hand shim, 250 on the left hand, which gave me my final backlash measurement of right around 8 thousandths of an inch. And I figured because this is a used set, I'll probably err on the side of being a little bit looser. So now all I've got to do is put the axles back in. I do have some new axle seals because I never replaced those last time around. Glue the cover on, fill it up with fluid, and then we'll make some changes to the tune, and then we're going for a test drive. Okay, so the regear is complete, the 342s are back in, it's filled up with oil, the brakes are on, the truck is back on the ground, and we're more or less ready for our first test drive. Now, if you're regearing on your own and you don't have tuning software, you can drive the truck before you make the corrections, like if you got to drive to a dyno shop or your tuner or whatever. But obviously before you go wide open throttle, it is a good idea to make sure those shift points are where you need to be, because they could either be way too high or way too low depending on which direction that you have regeared. Now, there is a utility in HP tuners that'll automatically change the speedometer and the shift point scaling for you, but I seem to have better success using a tool like Blue Cat, which is a utility you can download. You can enter in your tire size, gear ratio, and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, for the speedometer, I always calculate that based on the tire manufacturer's revolution per mile. Like, I think these Toyos I have on here, the website says they're 681 revolutions per mile. That's usually the most accurate. Then you use that and some simple math to figure out the speedometer pulses per mile and so on. Anyhow, the tune is 100% complete and we're ready to flash it in the truck, and then we'll go for our test drive. I am regretting having to remove that AC compressor though on a day like today. I think it's like 90 degrees outside. I've got the windows like halfway up, so I'm trying not to make too much noise for the camera there. I've got the little wind sock on it, so hopefully you can even hear what I'm about to say, but love summertime. I think the one thing I will say right away is I can kind of hear like that turbo spool noise a little bit easier than I could before in terms of how much throttle I'm putting in. So driving it like, let's see, it's like 55 miles an hour right now. And the first thing you do is just kind of a sanity check. Does that make sense for how fast you're going? So I always got, you know, the GPS speedometer. Let's see if I can get this to match up. This says, so my needle says 54. This one says 54, 53, kind of back and forth. So, yep, 55. So speedometer, I'm going to say, is exactly where it needs to be. So that's fine. So I'm in third gear, manual third, and I'm going about like 55 miles an hour. And before, I would have had to have been in fourth gear to have the same RPM at the same road speed. So that's a major improvement right now, which means I can put it up in overdrive, cruise 75, 80 all day long now. And I haven't gone that fast yet, probably, I don't know, 24, 2,500 RPM, where before it was like 3,000 or 3,200 if you were going to cruise like 80. So reduced mileage, or reduced mile per hour, great. The next thing is, how does it feel taking off? I will say I noticed a slight reduction in throttle response, just in terms of like, say you want to get going a little bit faster, you just put your foot down a tiny bit more. Those 430s, it would scoot with like zero throttle input, where now I use the same throttle, but I still feel acceleration, but it's not quite what it was before. You know, I'm just talking really, really light throttle. So the real test, of course, is when we get into boost, how is that going to feel? I'll get a clear spot of road up here in a second, and we'll give that a shot. Pulls a lot harder on the top end, that is for sure. Oh crap, that is... My tires are rubbing the fenders too, you can probably hear that. Yep, she pulls pretty good, boys. So yeah, I definitely lost a little bit from like 0 to 15, 0 to 20 miles an hour, but beyond that, we're golden, man. This thing pulls hard. And the other benefit to this is I used to have a little drive shaft vibration with the 430s, because the drive shaft is spinning so fast, but now with the 342s, I got roughly 100 miles an hour. It's kind of hard to tell because the speedometer stops after 100, but no vibration, smooth as silk. This thing just wants to keep on pulling, so I am happy with the change. right, so there is one last test that we, of course, have to do. Regearing it. That's the burnout test. So I am going to hold my foot on the brake just a little bit, see how she does. Yep, still does it. All right, I'm calling it a win. So right now I am really happy with my decision to go from the 430s back to the 342s. I feel like it's improved every single aspect of this truck. Its drivability on the highway, it almost feels like it's a little bit faster down low as well. So I'm gonna call this a huge win in my book. Now, the one thing I wish I would have done would have been to go to a drag strip with the 430s, then immediately back with the 342s, just to get some good data as far as a comparison. But right now, all I have is just kind of that seat of the pants thing. Eventually, I'd like to find some other way to do a comparison to a before and after, and that would involve a rematch with a roll race against a certain brown C10 that completely smoked me last time. But I know the guy that owns it, Bill, so maybe we'll get another roll race lined up at some point and see if these 342s have made any improvement into how it drives. But right now, I believe that they have made a big difference, and I'm happy that I took the time to change it. And it only cost me like probably 30 bucks between one new pinion bearing, a couple seals, and a little bit of gear oil. So overall, I'm calling this a win, and we probably will even get some better fuel mileage as well. Again, not that I've ever measured or tracked that, but that's gonna bring this video to an end. So I wanna say thank you guys for watching. Help me out, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think about the gear ratio that we went with. And finally, don't forget to click that like button if you have enjoyed today's content. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you again in another couple of days.